Hello there. You're very welcome to another Irish Voices Conversations with the Irish Diaspora. I'm Donagh McKeown, and we continue our conversation among that diaspora. The Irish diaspora spreads far and wide right across the globe. We've been migrating from this small island on the edge of the western seaboard for more than 2, if not 3 millennia. In recent years, it's been a temporary migration for some, backwards and forwards by airplane. Before that, many went by ship, mostly to America and Canada, but certainly in other directions as well. So we reflect the stories of some, at the moment, of recent members of the diaspora. And as the programme continues, we will be talking to those of first, second, third, fourth, and goodness knows fifth generation who have left, once again, the beautiful country that is Ireland. On the programme today, we talk to a lady who has migrated from Dublin many years ago to finally end up in Palo Alto in California. Her name is Emer Martin, and she takes up the story.
I was born in the Coombe Hospital in Dublin and raised in Dublin. But then when I went back, I left. And then when I went back to Ireland, I spent 10 years in Meath. And my mother's from Cavan and her family were from Tyrone. And my dad's from Meath and Mayo. His mother was a Mayo woman.
A mixed connection there of Irishness all over the whole island of Ireland. What are your early memories of living in Ireland and what those early years meant to you?
Well, growing up in Ireland, I guess we were kids of the 1970s. So it was a very different Ireland from the Ireland I see now, almost unimaginably different. I would say it was poor and grim in many ways. There were all the troubles going on in the north. There was a huge recession. It was assumed when you'd grow up, you'd leave, like most people did. And we were very much under the thumb of the Catholic Church. Like all our schools were Catholic. The nuns were our teachers. And it was I remember even nuns telling us and my fellow school friends saying that women shouldn't work because it takes away jobs from men, because there was so much unemployment, so women should stay at home. And just attitudes like that I remember.
It's amazing, and that's just back in the 1970s. You think that's a thing of the deep, distant past of meeting each other at the crossroads and the fair maidens of Ireland. But, it hadn't really moved on even in the 1970s by the sound of it.
Yeah, or even in the 80s. By the time I left Ireland on my travels around 1985, it was still that very small, narrow place. I loved Ireland and I loved all the old traditions of it and the old stories, but I really didn't like the 80s modern Ireland. It wasn't for me. So off I went.
Well, before you go, I mean, there had to be the positive sides there. You were saying about the Irish culture, as it were. I mean, growing up, it wasn't all. I mean, I know, having grown up in different schooling situations where laity made it a lot easier. But if you had recognised members of the church, it was a tougher kind of place. But there must have been good times in that too.
There was like I loved going to my grandparents' house out of Dublin. I remember my one grandparent who lived in Cootehill. So, and they lived right on the main street of Cootehill. And that was great to be kids and be right in a town and have the run of the place. Like we'd be running up and down to Boyle's sweet shop. And the same with Trim. We were able to walk into Trim and we had the castle just beside us and the Boyne River and great freedom, like great freedom when I think of it. So, and I know a lot of people bemoan that loss of freedom that And it's our fault. We kind of helicoptered around our own children. For some reason, for some strange reason, we decided we'd make it all better, and I think we made it all worse. But our own parents, it was benign neglect all the way. So that was
a great description.
Yeah, and that I think gave us all this fierce independence. There also was, like, when I think I left home at 17. And went off to Paris, and that wasn't uncommon. And you just made your way around with no social media, no way of contacting, the odd letter home every 4 or 5 months. It was very different. Now we're all so much in contact with each other.
So Paris, why did you choose Paris, and what were the circumstances as to go there?
Very little choosing, except I saw an ad in the newspaper for an agency that would look for au pairs in Paris, and I wanted to get out of Ireland, and I literally signed up and went to be an au pair in Paris, and that was it. That started me off traveling really for around 8 years of just traveling and working in different places and living in Amsterdam and London, Paris, and I lived in Israel for a year. And went down to Egypt and just then made my way to the US and lived in Savannah, Georgia, and down in New Orleans and in San Francisco, and went off down to Mexico and Cuba. It was just, I was wandering for years.
My goodness, you've got a half a dozen wandering feet there, not just the normal pair. I mean, that's a pretty extensive route. What were you wearing an Irish badge on your chest as you were doing all this, or was it just to ingratiate yourself to where you were?
Well, I think we see the world through lenses, don't we? And we can't help the lens we see through often. And yeah, I very much saw the world through an Irish lens because you relate everything back to what you know, which was my upbringing. So there were times I remember when I wouldn't meet an Irish person for like 8 or 9 months. And then suddenly I'd meet one and witness the great disappointment. No, I'm joking, but even though I was well away from Ireland and not meeting other Irish people, I was seeing it through the lens of where I grew up. I mean, it was this small, cold little island in Northern Europe that had been very heavily colonized and had lost a lot, but had kept a lot too. And I was always interested in looking at that. I think I had sympathy for people who had similarly felt such hands of power and colonization. That definitely, when I met my husband, Afshin, he's Persian, and that was a great empire. So he saw the world very differently from how I saw the world in a way.
And where did you meet?
We met in a little town outside of Los Angeles called Redlands. He approached me with a bottle of mezcal and said, somebody said we should meet. And he offered me the mezcal. I took a sip and then he said, that's nowhere near the worm. That's pathetic. And as my kids said, that was a warning sign. That was a warning sign. So, but I didn't. Yes, it was a warning sign. I didn't listen to any of the warning signs. So here I am.
And there was me trying to fish for a very romantic encounter somewhere in Beirut in a cafe, sipping margaritas or whatever it might have been, and he was reading Rumi to you or something. And then you turn out to be somewhere in Los Angeles. Well, I can get over the disappointment, I'm sure. What was he?
What about me? Can I get over the disappointment?
Well, we all make these decisions in our lives, don't we? I'm not a counselling service, unfortunately, Emer. but was he bringing that rich Persian culture? You said about his mindset and his lens. Was there a mixture of cultural ideas and philosophies?
Oh, definitely. And I think through him, I became fascinated with Persian culture. To this day, I have books on Persian art, and I love that architecture. I dream of going to Isfahan and Shiraz, which we were meant to go in the summer, but of course COVID happened and scuppered it all. But I'll get there maybe next summer and see see all of those things I've been longing to see. And the poets, Rumi and Hafez and all of those, which are like Rumi through translation, and there's some controversy over Coleman Barks and his translation of Rumi because he doesn't actually speak Farsi, so that's a little strange. But his translations or interpretations, maybe I should say, it's the best-selling poetry in the U.S. is a 12th century Persian mystic, which is an amazing idea, right?
We have a couple of friends who join us on a poetry event on Wednesday nights, and we regularly have Rumi poems, and they're breathtaking in their simplicity in many ways, and they're the spiritual dimension that speaks to everyone, whether you're from Persia or otherwise. It's quite amazing, and you see it in other Irish poets to some degree, but not to the degree you see it in that. So, I mean, even though he's coming from a different place, surely you can see that this is a universal gift that can be shared.
Exactly. And I think Hafez, the same, the poets that lasted through, and the great tradition of poetry in the Middle East is similar to the great tradition of poetry in Ireland. So, you know, the emphasis on the word and the poet being elevated, being like the access to the spiritual world, really. And I think Ireland has that too. In fact, I was just reading a book that I reread. It's a same publisher as me, the Lilliput Press, and it's the Irish tradition, Robin Flower. And it's I love this book. It's all about the time when Ireland was kind of like Tibet. Like Ireland was this mystical land of like a deeply spiritual place that people came from Europe to study in Ireland with these monks. And it wasn't just organized monasteries. There were all these mad mystic monks and holy women living in woods. Ireland was densely covered by woods at that stage. And just reading about that time, it's quite extraordinary what Ireland was for the world at that time. It certainly was this special place, probably like Tibet, you know.
I mean, from little knowledge that I would have or understanding, a lot of this is Celtic, but it's Celtic Christianity. Would that be fair to say? It's not just pure Celtism. It's that mixture of that style of Christianity.
Definitely. It was that sort of synthesis of both worlds that really, became incredibly kind of fertile time in Ireland for just art and literature and, with real depth. And what, when I'm reading them, the poems from the monks, they're mostly poems about birds, as far as I can see, because I guess when you're living in woods or out in the monastery, you're living in a world of birds and animals. So it's quite some quite beautiful poems.
Isn't there a very famous Irish poem? It's about yellow bittern. Is that of that?
Oh, yellow bittern cry. Yes, there is.
That's of that era, and it's a really ancient poem, as it were. I read very briefly recently, because as I am not a student here, I am just kind of pick and choose in bits and pieces. I saw the suggestion that perhaps, except for Augustine, I think it was Augustine, who changed the whole thought patterns of Christianity at that stage, which turns out to be the Catholic Church, and then it changed and swifted into different divisions thereafter. But it was at that point that there was some dispute or argument within the group, typical, of course, let's disagree to disagree, and that the Celtic mysticism and whatever was lost in Catholicism thereafter, or certainly subsumed by Augustine, and the idea of guilt and women being ostracized and all sorts of things. Is that your understanding of it too?
Yeah, and I would say that sort of moment, there's a kind of calling in where, like, the Irish were called in under the wing of Rome because they had gone completely rogue. They'd gone off on their own, trajectory, really, which was a much more mystical Christianity, which is why I think, and they're like Rumi and Hafez are Muslim poets. They're Islamic poets, but their Islam is Sufism. And I think the Irish were very close to that. I think from what I read and what I see, it was a mystical Sufi. There was no way those monks living out on the Skellig Islands were not, mad mystics, really. When you go out there and have a look at their life and the world they were in, which wasn't really a human world at all. It was a world of birds and a world of water and a world of sea. And they were completely really at one living out there. So I agree that there was a calling in and calling to task of these sort of very independent monks.
How do you read a mystic, he's called to some degree? He's a poet too, deceased a few years ago, John O'Donoghue. Is he of that tradition, would you say? Does he lean towards that Irish kind of connection back to that kind of time?
I have to confess, I've never delved into John O'Donoghue, have you? But I think he is very popular over here, and I see him quoted a lot, but I have to confess somewhat ignorance when it comes to him. Have you read him?
Oh, yes. He's a beautiful writer, Anam Cara, and harks back to the love of soul and all the rest of it, and blessings and all sorts. So I think he's in that vein. I'll point you towards him. I won't charge you any extra for that either. Okay. I'm thoughtful that way. Not every day you get to talk to somebody about the spiritualism of and the Irishness in spirituality, is it? But you never know who you're talking to. Let's talk some more. And you did mention books and publishers and all the rest, and we will come to your publications in time, and a new one, I understand, too. So we're looking forward to that. This is a program that kind of reaches out to see where you are, where you've been on that diaspora journey. And obviously the monks were very much on the diaspora journey. As you say, there was a richness of them here. Columbanus would have gone to the island at the tip of Iona, as it were, and set up there, and then expanded out from there. And they were the original diaspora, as it were, or certainly in our living memory. As a member of that diaspora, you must have been so enriched by going to all those different places and locations. How much of that is with you still? I mean, obviously, Persia is because of your association with your husband, but the other countries that you visited?
I think of them all the time. I think that was a really important thing for me to do. And I teach teenagers now in a high school here, and I see them rush so quickly in to get into some college to move forward in life. And I'm asking them, what are you rushing for? You're only going to end up in a job. Don't you know that? That's not that exciting. Stop rushing. Take some time, travel. And I think everybody should wander for a bit in their lives. I think it's just gives you such perspective. And also, you're living in a place where you don't speak languages. You can be very vulnerable. You're right at the bottom of the society, really, in many ways. And that's a humbling experience. You're not woven in. So you can kind of see societies clearly when you're at the bottom, way more than when you sweep in as a tourist and stay on a beach in a gated resort. So it gave it, and the people I met, and what I was struck, it was hard at times, and I was moving around and arriving in countries with very little money and knowing nobody. But, there was always the proverbial kindness of strangers. And I sometimes think of those strangers who just offered me something for nothing. So many people did. I met such kind people throughout, from Egypt to Israel to Holland to Mexico, and just people who, I remember being very ill in Mexico and staying in a hotel, and the family who ran the hotel in Merida just took care of me. They just brought me up soup. They took care of me. They, I'll never forget their kindness, because I was in a fever and I was just very sick at that time. And again, I remember getting sick in Egypt as well. I got amoebic dysentery and ended up in a hospital, and people took care of me.
And you need taken care of when you have amoebic dysentery, that's for sure. It's, oh, my goodness. My goodness. It's life threatening, but I think the circumstances around it are the horrific, are absolutely horrific. We'll not go into the graphic details. We'll leave it to others' imaginations. How much of, and I ask this question regularly when we're talking diaspora, and I'll ask it again in your current living situation, how much of what others thought of Ireland was reflected back to you, and how did that change your overall view of the circumstance when you heard things from their lens, community or individuals, about Ireland?
Well, I remember being around the pyramids of Giza, and it would have been probably 1990 or 1989, and the Egyptians would come up, and when you tell them you're Irish, they would say, Bobby Sands, Johnny Logan. Bobby Sands, Johnny Logan. They were the two Irish people that they knew and celebrated. And and then I had this vision in my head of Bobby Sands and Johnny Logan together. So, they had U2 were a big thing. People would immediately talk, you're Irish. Oh, U2, Sunday, Bloody Sunday. They would be, everybody loved that song. And also the struggle in Ireland was very resonant when you were in places like Egypt or Israel, talking to the Palestinians. And they were heroes to them because they were resisting colonialism. And then you'd go up, I remember going up to France, living in Paris, and they'd say, Irish, boom, and just make a bomb sound. And I'd be like, there's a little more to Ireland than just a bomb, thank you. And that was the impression. And they would go, the French would always say, Ireland sauvage, which means wild, but I also think they kind of half meant savage too.
Oh dear. And such an influx of French and Spanish and Germans who came to Ireland, as you know, from the 70s onwards. They were the ones who could afford to buy up the cheaper land and love it. Many people from those have enriched those parts of Cork and Kerry and Cavan and Monaghan, and they come for the fishing or whatever it may be. So that's an enrichment on the way back.
My Kerry friend said, we'd be lost in Kerry without the Dutch, because she said they come here and they open nice little boutique cheese shops and they sell good ware. And if you want to, they do bring a lot to rural Ireland.
Let's get a piece of music. We'll talk some more. You've a choice of two or three. If you've only got two, that's grand. But let's hear your first choice and a relevance of why you kind of chosen it.
Well, it's Echo Bones' song, and Echo Bones are a new Irish group, and they were just getting traction when COVID hit. Like, they had released their first single, they were ready. They were very popular on the gigging circuit around Dublin, and I think Sarah O'Loughlin has a gorgeous voice. Just love her voice, and the music is a kind of just a good vibe. So. Yeah, I think once COVID goes, I hope they survive. I know and I feel for a lot of the young bands out there, because they were just starting out and they rely on gigging more than anything to get known. So it's been very difficult for young musicians in Dublin during COVID.
We're talking to Emer Martin, who now lives in California, and she's been there for quite a few years. And I think you have a couple of kids, don't you?
I do. I have two daughters who are living here in the house with me in the Bay Area. But one is finishing up high school and wants to head back to Ireland, and was saying, I'm just going to pretend America didn't happen.
Oh dear. Well, we talk about that experience as much as you can talk about your children, because I think the usual rules apply. It's up to you if you wish to talk about them. But as you know, many youngsters don't want anybody to talk about them, don't want the pictures shown, don't want to be talked about by mums and dads and otherwise. So we'll leave that to your discretion as the discussion goes forward. But let's take you to your arrival in, either in Los Angeles or wherever you arrived in America. How different was the experience there, and what made you make the choice to make that more permanent than just all the travelling around?
Well, yeah, I was living up in, I just was floating through Los Angeles when I met my future husband on the lawn with his bottle of mezcal. And when I lived up in San Francisco that summer, and then went to Mexico for a couple of months and off to Cuba. And then I was heading back through New York with the full intention. I thought I'd go back and live in Paris. I really liked Paris out of all the places in Europe. So I was heading back towards France. And then in New York, my husband was living there, working at Bell Labs. He's a physicist. So that was it. I stayed on. I went back to Ireland, and then I came back to him. And so that gave me some roots. I stayed because he was there. And then I went to, it was he who encouraged me to go to Hunter College. So I sat down, I wrote my first book, Breakfast in Babylon. And I was waitressing in New York and writing, like every waitress is always doing something else. So then when I finished Breakfast in Babylon...
Well, tell us a little bit about Breakfast in Babylon. What is it about? Is it fictional, factional, between the two?
Well, I think, you see, fiction is the most efficient way of getting to the truth. You know, it is the truth unfettered. If you're sitting around to write a biography, you're very constrained by everything. And like you say, about the kids and what people think about you and who wants you talking about them. So fiction, you can write it all down and fictionalize it and get to the truth very quickly. So Breakfast in Babylon was based on my travels and based in my life in the squats. The squats were a great resource then. Loads of young Irish people would leave and go to squats in London and Paris and Berlin and Hamburg. There was a network of squats around Europe where you could stay for free. And we just kind of moved through those places. They were kind of liminal anarchist places, and with a whole host of characters and very vivid places, very seminal. You'd be sitting there with young travelers who would be just there for a week, and then the Afghan war was going on. So there'd be Afghan refugees who had just come through the horrors of war, and we'd all be sitting around together in these squats. It was, even though Europe at that point, that was the late 80s, early 90s, it was in a recession. It wasn't the, fast, flashy place you see now in Europe, but it had these squats, and the whole underground culture had great life to it.
Were you considering yourself as an anarchist at the time or then? I mean, usually with words, they can be derogatory or they can be positive, whatever you choose them to be. So I'm not wishing to point what I think or don't think about what an anarchist is, but did you see yourself as one, and what type would you have been or were if you were?
Well, I never really wanted the ist beside my name, so whether any ist, I didn't want it. So maybe spoken like a true anarchist, I didn't want to be an anarchist.
It's on the same lines as "Thank God I'm an atheist," isn't it?
It is. So no, I wasn't driven by political ideologies at the time. I was even, in fact, rather naive. I'm way more aware of political systems now. I mean, I was just coming out of a sort of limited secondary school education with the nuns, limited and rich in some ways. Like I was able to recite a lot of poetry. We had to learn all our poems and all our Shakespeare off by heart. Feel
free to give us a few poems. I mean, we've got plenty of time here.
But I was always grateful. Actually, I was always grateful to have that being forced to learn things off by heart, which nobody is forced to do now. It was at one point terrifying. I'm sure if you went through the Irish school system, you'd have to go home and learn your poem as homework, and then you'd come back.
Often, yeah. And if you didn't, you were dismissed and disgusted by the rest of the class. It was a kind of let's demean every pupil in the room if we can.
Yeah, like a terrible from an educational point of view. It's horrific, but actually, I remember, and when I think, because I'm a teach literature now, I think of the waste of class time they spent just literally going around with terrified students. You'd have to stand up and say your verse. But in saying that, once we got through the absolute pain, I did have this wealth of poems from John Donne to T.S. Eliot and Patrick Kavanagh. So I always loved poetry and literature. So I was a great reader. Wherever I went, I'd find the English bookshop and stock up on books. And when you be at these places, we'd all be swapping books, because you'll have to remember, we didn't have phones and we didn't have access to any visual medium. You had to pay to go into a cinema. There were no TVs there. So literally we swapped books all the time, these dog-eared books that would be swapped around. So that was very much part of life then.
Do you ever think this literature idea will catch on?
It ebbs and flows. So
you've produced the first book, published it, and you are still in New York. When did things change in that front?
Well, I was in New York, and Breakfast in Babylon actually won Book of the Year in the Listowel that year, and I think it had an impact at
their annual Writers' Festival.
That's right. Yeah.
Cool.
So that brought it some attention, and I don't think anybody had written about that whole sort of Irish diaspora punk scene before, and so I think the book did have some impact. I found it. I started to see it everywhere. I remember seeing when I went to hostels in Bangkok, there'd be a dog-eared copy of Breakfast in Babylon there. So it kind of
that'd been cool. Wow.
Yeah, it kind of became a sort of underground cult book for people who had lived this life, and there were many of us who had lived this life. Like if you ask, a lot of Irish people would have drifted and sat and done hair braiding on the slopes of the Pompidou Centre for the summer, even, and just got a taste of that life. And people in places and shared places in New York and San Francisco, and the Irish were everywhere you'd go, kind of living communally as we would, because it was financially what was feasible. But there'd be big groups of Irish people living like this, and I think Breakfast in Babylon, it struck a chord. So it's sold about 50,000 copies in the US.
It sold how many?
About 50,000 copies.
Wow! Would you have any money left from it? And if you do, here's my address.
Oh my goodness! Yeah.
So
money and books never really mix.
Apparently not, unless you're the publisher. But that's another story for another day. What about the experience then to move? When did you decide to move to the West Coast, and what was the reasoning for all that?
Well, again, not much reasoning except that Bell Labs, where my husband worked, was just collapsing. Things were changing, and Silicon Valley was the place to be. So he packed up to go leave becoming a researcher and try and get into the more commercial world of tech in Silicon Valley. So I had just had my first child, Jasmine, in the year 2000. So he dragged me out with him, and I have to say I was horrified at the beginning, absolutely horrified to find myself in an apartment complex in Sunnyvale in the midst of the tech world, where it certainly was not a literary hub. Whenever I told people I was a writer, they would say, "Oh, what code do you write?"
A software writer, yeah.
Yeah, and I'd be like, "No, I write books," and they'd stare at me blankly and lose interest immediately. So And there I was with a new child, and I didn't know people. And I remember just standing by the fence looking at the freeway of their apartment complex, and I felt like a kind of grub worm looking out at all these people whose lives were going places. And I was kind of fascinated, thinking, all these cars seem very in a hurry to go somewhere, and I literally have nowhere to go. So it was that sort of feeling of, people asked afterwards going, did you postpartum depression? And I was saying, no, I think I just realized I'd ruined my life.
Oh, so, dear. Oh, dear. There's a certain irony strikes me here in hearing your story and as to where you went. I don't know how much you know of the history of California and the Irish in California. I'm sure you do, because you've lived there long enough. Sunnyvale is where the Murphy family set up their biggest ranches in California before the gold rush. I'm sure you're aware of that.
Yeah, because they have Murphy Street and they have Murphy's. Yeah, I'd read a little about them.
They were the first two to be successful in California. Maybe a few
really?
Yeah, very much so. Very much in San Diego, perhaps there might have been some before them. But the Murphy's ranches stretched up beyond north of San Francisco into Marin County. There's Rancho Mateo, if I'm not mistaken, around what's the town called, where the city capital of Marin is, San Rafael. And if you look and if you dig deep enough, the Murphys were there before San Francisco became San Francisco, even in the 1840s. I'm thinking just after the Englishman Richardson founded the Englishness of the city, and then the Irish followed in behind. You obviously do know that it's a big Irish city, of course, but the Murphys were there first before any of them. Quite amazing.
I didn't know that history. That's fascinating. And I think of it a lot because when I came here, like reading, I remember reading the Illustrated History of the West. I think it's the companion to that TV series, The West, the PBS documentary series, which is just beautiful. But reading about just the native people and the displacement, it's really recent in California. It's very hard to feel the native presence in New York, but when I came here, that was the first thing I was aware of. Whose land was I on? And because it's a very new place, isn't it? Like when we're talking about the Murphys, that's the 1800s. That's literally when, that would be yesterday in Ireland.
Absolutely. The 1830s and 40s, the town of Murphys, just at the foot of the Sierras, I think, was where they came to first. They named the whole town after them too. Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating story, and as you say, extremely recent. And sadly, if you study the history of San Francisco, the city itself, Yerba Buena, and the Native Americans who were there, the last one died in the early 1900s, I'm thinking, and no generation since, and a whole nation disappeared. I mean, it's incredible, and it's almost within 3 generations of our really experience. It's really sad.
It's very close, and it's very. I think it's key to think that Ireland, a lot of people were fleeing the colonization, and then we came here and took part in our own colonization of native land, and that was very much in my mind, that kind of irony when I came here of whose land is this? Whose land am I on? Who does it really belong to? And that actually led me recently. I've co-founded with a group of other people, a group of Irish and Irish Americans. So it's the Irish Diaspora Decolonization. And we just started this group to try and address that, because there's a lot of Irish people here in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, and who feel this and who realize that we were part of the colonization, and that a lot of the native people, they're still here. Like they're still here. They're still around us. They're, they're part of us, and so we formed this alliance to to become allies with them and to amplify their voices and to see what they need. So
it's a topic. It's a topic that comes up regularly in this conversation about the diaspora and the realization from some who've gone to other places. What strikes me as interesting, Emer, having spoken about that Celtic mysticism and the Celtic Christianity period of things, that then. As with the Native American population, you talked about who owned the land. I have this belief that Irish Celticism would have talked about being looking after the land, and it's when the Irish psyche moved into thinking we have to own the land that problems and things come along. It's like the isms. Once you change that mindset, it changes the whole course of all sorts of things. And maybe an embracement of that idea with the Native American culture, who don't look at it as being their land, even though they were here for longer. They're just looking after the land. Does that have a resonance in the stream of our consciousness here in this conversation?
Yes, definitely. And I think even as I said, who owns the land, I was referring to the people who now own it or think they own it, but because before. Like the native people, like the indigenous Irish people would have believed that the land is in us. It's part of us. It speaks through us. We are part of the land. It's not a ownership thing. And I think so this Irish Diaspora Decolonization Alliance that we're just in the beginnings set up, we launched last week for the Bay Area. That's very much aware of that idea that, the idea of ownership of the land, I think, has led to a lot of destruction of the land.
Let me take you a little bit back from where you're moving to with that, just to reflect. As you were moving more and more into California, and you realized Sunnyvale was, well, it's like saying I'm in the middle of nowhere here. And then maybe does the realization come to you that there's a lot of Irish about here? Not that you have to tag on to them, but that there is an Irish community and an Irish dimension. What was your perception at that time as being a member of the diaspora, or did you ignore that for a long time?
No, I mean, I interestingly, when I moved, I thought, one of my school friends from secondary school, I believe she's living out here, and she was a good friend of mine. So I contacted her, and it turns out she was living half a mile down the road.
Fiona, there you go.
Fiona Weston. So I had my community here, and I've great friends up in San Francisco, Hugh Diamond, and the filmmaker was over in Oakland, Niall McKay. And I miss Niall from the Bay Area because he used to throw great parties in Oakland and invite all the Irish people he knew. And it was a kind of network that actually I lost a lot of that network when he moved away. You need people right in the diaspora who are willing to throw the parties.
I always like to go to them. I'd never had a location, but I always like the idea of them. I concur with that. There's learning and there's growth in a party for sure. It's an Irish thing, isn't it?
It is. And it's a way of meeting people and just sort of relaxing and networking. And, everybody does it. It's like a networking thing as well.
Well, sometimes the networking is just good from a personal point of view, but sometimes it helps the overall growth of ideas and the idea of a diaspora. Did you feel that there was that strength in that Irish scheme of things? Had it influence in others? Had it influence or respect among your community outside of the Irish? If that makes sense?
Definitely. And definitely, I think, community is really important in any ways. And we had Catherine, who had set up the Los Gatos Irish Festival. Unfortunately, COVID put an end to that, and I don't know if it's going on this year, but it's that, these things are important. When I think I met you down at that festival, when you bring people together, both from the area and from Ireland to cultural events, and, a lot of ideas, people, often, you go to these events and the talks and the readings and they're wonderful, but it's the sitting around afterwards that really the ideas and connections and networks begin to flow. So I hope that Las Gatas Irish Festival takes off again, because it was a lovely event. I think they did it in conjunction with Listowel as well.
That's right. They were tied to the two. A beautiful festival with some wonderful people coming to talk, and other people, as you say, the relationships that we're building. And Catherine, we'll get on to talk about her. I hope her diaspora circumstance, because she set up a whole linking network now of cultures, where what is it called? You'll have to come up and tell me what the organisation is called, but it spreads the word of Irish connection.
It does. The Bay Area Irish, and she has a Facebook page and a website and all of that, and and it takes people like that. It takes people like Catherine Barry, who are the organisers. It always does. You always need. It's a community, right? And you need people like that to. Willing to put in the work, because Catherine, I remember going with her to get venues down there and helping her out, and it was all a labor of love. It's all unpaid labor, and often women do it. Women are the organizers. If you go down to Listowel Writers Week, even you'll see it's women of Ireland volunteering at all these festivals, keeping the culture going. Often, women put in a great. Give great time and effort for, and what they get in return really is the I guess satisfaction of bringing people together and keeping the ideas flowing and keeping the culture alive. It's a very selfless thing they do,
and it's much to be applauded. That's for sure. I'm sure there are a few men who are involved too. Let's be honest here.
Maybe to make the tea, and if you cut the
That's it. Let's return to the old values. Just turn the sex into the male doing all that, making the tea, because it used to be the other way around, didn't it? Of course, at least that was the talk of it. The cultural way of it. Sure, it's great to see you here at the committee tonight, Maggie. Would you make a cup of tea for us all? Yeah, but it's kind of moved past that. I mean, in the middle of that, there's that change of attitude too. Because I thought of it when we were talking earlier about attitudes in Ireland and the schooling and all the rest of it. But it wasn't a very feministic kind of society by any stretch of the imagination. Has it changed, do you think, from your point of view?
Yeah, I look at my nieces and they're in a different world. I remember when they were younger, they were calling my mother and my sister and I feminazis and saying, "Oh, everything is feminism for you."
Sorry, a feminazi?
Feminazi, yeah.
Okay.
And then I said, they were young then, and I said, just wait, you'll see. So, and now they're all, of course, diehard feminists. So they saw there was a need for that. But like that, when we were growing up, the idea of feminism or any equality, the church had a huge part, which is a very patriarchal organization and structure, in keeping women down and silent and not as full equal members of the society. I certainly didn't feel a full and equal member of the society growing up. So that, I think, has changed. There's a ways to go if you look at positions of power in Ireland, and we're still not there yet, but their lives are very different from our lives. Like, they have, reproductive choices that we did not have. Even I think when I look at the vote for marriage equality, that was a huge vote in the psyche of Ireland. It was a huge letting go. It was not just about marriage equality. It was also saying we will not be dominated by the narrow morals of the church, which leave out huge parts of the community, like women, like gay people. And it was a release. I remember the celebrations. It was just more beyond the entire country kind of went out onto the street in joy. There was a joy because it was I really felt that was a very significant moment in releasing ourselves from the church.
One other aspect, and it emerged while I was in California, the vote to ban restrictions and change gender interpretation and all sorts of things with the freeing up in legislation for the right to be gay or otherwise. You remember it's only about 5-6 years ago when the Irish voted to change their laws, and very shortly afterwards, as you know, California were changing their laws too. But it was as if everyone who was Irish was lauded in San Francisco and other ways for being at the forefront of changing laws and changing attitudes on that particular front too.
Well, we really were, because actually it was the only country, because of the way Ireland's set up, which is very democratic. If we have to change the constitution, you have to have a referendum to change the constitution. So the people get a say, which is very democratic. So no other country was really, they pushed it in through different legislations, but Ireland was where we voted, that the people of Ireland said, did we want this? And overwhelmingly, I think it was 68% or something like that. Every county except for, I think, Roscommon disgraced itself. There were some disgraceful places. I better Google that, but there was some disgraceful.
Our 3 Roscommon listeners have switched off now.
Yes, sorry, Roscommon, and you probably voted if you were, you probably voted the right way. So it was this moment of, that was an Ireland I couldn't have imagined. Like when I was growing up in the 80s, the idea of being gay was just very, hidden and secret, and for it to be fully legal and accepted, and people come out and celebrate with the LGBTQ community like that, it was just, a wonderful healing moment, and a guide to the world. I'm not sure in many other countries would that vote have gone through. It certainly, if you put it to all of America, it would not have gone through.
Let's go to your next piece of music. Okay,
my next piece of music, I chose it. It has a sort of special resonance for me. It's so the singer is Judith Mock, and she's singing actually in this piece. She has her Persian musicians who she accompany her. And Judith lives, we're actually very lucky that Judith is kind of national treasure, and she lives in Dublin. She moved because it's always these men moving us poets around the place, isn't it? She's married to Michael O'Loughlin, the poet, and they live in Dublin. And this is a song, but she is an international voice and talent. This is a song, a lament in Ladino. So that was the language of the Sephardic Jews. And this one is a 15th century Spanish song about a mother who finds her child dead in the cradle, and she can't tell her husband when he comes home. She just can't bear to tell him. So the song is actually a metaphor for the loss of the homeland when the Christians, as you know, they conquered the Iberian Peninsula, and they expelled all the Jews and Muslims and brought in a time of Spanish Inquisition and very dark days for anybody who weren't adhering to a very Orthodox Catholicism. So that's the setting of the song. It's really a metaphor for the lost child, the lost homeland.
You're listening to Irish Voices, Conversations with the Irish Diaspora. I'm Donagh McKeown, and my guest today is Emer Martin. And Emer, we're in California. That's where you're living. It's where we met. You've been writing for a number of years. You told us about your first book, and you've continued to write. And what else? What have you made your life around?
Well, my most recent novel...
Well, I was thinking more about about the working scenario. When we come to the novels, we're kind of saving those up a little bit for the end of the work. Yeah.
We'll save them. All right, then. So, I mean, how do I earn my crust?
I suppose so.
I'm a teacher out here in California. So I was teaching in Trinity College in the Trinity Access program when I was in Ireland. And when I moved over to the US, I was trying to get a job teaching in a college. And it was very exploitive. They only wanted to take me on as adjuncts in places. And this means you'll just be paid per class. So you could end up working, as I did for a few universities, you end up working and, it comes to about $12,000 a year at the end of it and no benefits. And you're like, well, I can't live like this. I live in California. I have 2 children. So I went back to college and had to sit again in a classroom. I had to sit in my 40s getting my teacher credential. It was like starting all over again. And I would be sitting and they would be partnering me up with lovely young student, and I'd be turning to her and saying, so what did you do this weekend? And she would say, oh, we were celebrating my sister's 21st. And I'd be thinking, oh my God, what did I do with my life? Why am I so far behind everybody else? So I did. It was a bit of a crisis sitting there going, here I go again. But actually it turned out to be the best thing I did. And I do remember, it reminds me of a story when I was 26. And it was my husband of Sheen. He told me, you should go to college. And I'd finished my book, Writing Breakfast in Babylon. And I said, no, I'm too old to go to college. I'm 26. By the time I graduate, I'd be 30. And he looked at me and said, you'll be 30 anyway.
Yeah.
And then I realized, oh, yeah, that's true. I might as well be 30 with a degree. So I kept that in mind because when I'd be doing something in my 30s and I'd be thinking, by the time I finish, I'll be 40. And then I'd be thinking, but I'll be 40 anyway. I might as well do it. So that was it. While I was sitting in my 40s, back again in college for the 3rd time, the 3rd degree in many ways, a metaphor there. And then I got my high school teaching credential for English. And I teach in a local school here, a local public school in Sunnyvale, Fremont High School. And I actually love it. I love it. I teach journalism and literature, and it's been, the only thing is it takes up all my time. That teaching in college, they leave you time to do your own work because they want you to be writing books and doing other things. That's good for the college. Whereas this one is like the whale that has swallowed me whole. I am sitting in the belly of the whale. It's it's really a 9 to 5, 5 day a week, planning on weekends, grading on weekends. So it's hard to keep creative with a full-time job. It really is. And anybody who does it and knows that. So kudos to anybody who can survive creatively.
It's amazing though that I've kind of watched you during COVID with the posts that you make about the experience of the young folk. You'd think it'd be a great advantage. You don't have to get in front of all these screaming kids. And yet it's what you probably missed most, getting in front of all those people. They're not screaming kids. They're what, 19, 18, yeah. 17, that sort of age. Yeah,
but no, it's me who's the screaming person. I'm just they're fine. They're very mellow. But yeah, no, that just because we weren't in person, I was getting up and just teaching as usual on the screen, and a little break between classes and another class. So I was just zooming teaching. So there was still the grading and the prepping and the planning and the office hours and the meetings. It was just all done from my garage, which that was kind of nice. I was enjoying the commute, rolling out of bed 20 minutes before class.
I can understand that one. The commute to do this job is equally challenging. It's from the front room to the second bedroom. Yeah,
I highly recommend that commute. Highly,
without doubt. And
it's very good for the environment too.
Did it give you any more time to write? Well, maybe we'll come to that. It's fairly obvious that you've nearly expressed that you've had some time to write. The writing is where our paths crossed. The Cruelty Man. Tell me about the writing of that, the origins of it, why you wrote it, and your experience of writing it, and what it means to you now that it's all behind you.
Well, when I was writing The Cruelty Men, it started off as it always does. Somebody once said to me, I've all these great masterpieces inside me if I wouldn't keep ruining them by writing them down. And I think of that all the time. So it started off as a different vision, and then it was driving along and listening to the Joe Duffy show, and suddenly the Murphy Report and the Ryan Report were being released in Ireland. And these extraordinary stories were coming out of industrial schools and laundries and really just being brought to light of what was going on in Ireland, kind of in full sight, in plain sight, but how, talk about motivated blindness, how people had decided not to see what was actually happening. So I went to the Oireachtas, and you can get a copy of the Ryan Report and the Murphy Report, and I read through them, and then I knew. I thought, I was heartbroken and disturbed, and it was just reading story after story. I thought, I have to write about this. This is our gulag. This is our Solzhenitsyn cancer ward. This is something catastrophic that happened in Ireland to very vulnerable people and very much class-based, the poor. It was the children of the poor. And so the whole Ireland. So I wanted to capture in Ireland two families, and it's two families. One is the middle class family of the school teacher, which would have been, say, my father's family. The school teacher living this very idyllic Ireland, living that kind of beautiful Irish life of blackberry picking. They went and got their water from a well. They, had lovely evenings with their parents. So the priest would come in and the local solicitor, and they'd sing songs and have a poker night. And they lived that kind of gentle Irish life. But underneath, there was another Irish life going on beside them, that of the poor and the vulnerable, who were being scooped up and put into industrial schools and abused and made to work, and the women in the laundries, all of that. It was going on right there as part of the fabric of society. So I wanted to write about how that could happen on a very small island. And as soon as I told people what I was writing, everybody had a story for me. Like somebody was saying, who did you interview for this? I interviewed all of Ireland, because everybody in Ireland told me a story. Everybody had a family member who was put into the laundries or the industrial school, had some truck with that. And so The Cruelty Men really is about this whole Ireland. And then it goes back to the folk tales and displacement. So the folk tales and all that. The hag is very much a figure, and she's a figure in my new book too. So the hag is the one that holds it all together, because she's the embodiment of the land in Ireland, the old hag. There's great poems, The Hag of Beara, and down there, if you go to the Beara Peninsula, there's the big rock, which they say is the hag. But she is the land of Ireland. And I wanted to give her a voice too. Like we were talking about the native people here and the native people in Ireland having a very similar vision, a kind of animistic vision of like Japanese Shintoism, that everything's alive. Everything is a voice. Every tree, every rock has its own voice and consciousness. That would have been very much in the old Irish tradition as well. And the hag is the embodiment of that. And so she opens The Cruelty Men, and I'm writing a sequel to that. The Cruelty Men ends in 1968 on a bridge, Essex Bridge, symbolically linking North and South Dublin together, the two Irelands, economic parts of Ireland coming together. And this one is taking on really my lifetime from the 70s onward to, I think it ends in around 2016 or something.
It's an amazing thing. I mean, we were talking earlier about the history of the Irish in California in particular, is the 1840s and 1850s. And suddenly when you start to talk about the things like these schools and whatever, there are some people in living memory. I have to put my hand up and say, I have memories. I think I expressed this to you before, of, if not The Cruelty Men, certainly aspects of the Magdalen laundries in schooling terms in 1960s. Very vague ones, but because it was a boarding school, a Catholic boarding school, there was not intervention, but there were girls coming from the local Magdalen laundry, effectively, which we didn't realise at the time, who were coming and acting as workers in the school and for cleaning, making the food and all sorts of stuff. So, I mean, literally, we've of a certain age have touched this history without knowing it, and some have touched it more violently, as it were, who are actually those young people of that time, or those young women in particular, who lived this, and they're still living. It's more than frightening.
Yeah, and it's funny because they were in plain sight, and yet we chose. People chose not to listen to them because reading all the testimonials when I did in those reports, they said they came out and they appealed and they would tell the story and nobody wanted to listen. And for them, part of the healing was that they wanted to be listened to. These reports were healing in a way that finally, and I wrote the book with that in mind, that like I said, fiction is a way of getting to the truth, that I could put it all together in a fictional way and have those stories brought out, because they are very much part of the story of Ireland in the 20th century and what happened post-colonialization and what we did to ourselves. But what struck me was these people, they just wanted to be heard. They'd be calling into Joe Duffy and other places and telling these stories, and the relief was there was healing. Stories are medicine. There was healing in that people were finally listening. And when I was releasing The Cruelty Men, I remember having somebody tell me, don't talk, that stuff in the book about the Magdalens, and nobody cares about that. Talk about the stuff about the Irish Gaeltacht, because there's a setting in the Irish Gaeltacht in Meath, and they go, that's more interesting. But yet, when it came out, everybody wanted to talk about the Magdalen and the laundries and the industrial schools. So even now, people think people aren't interested, but that's, coming from a place of privilege where people go, well, I'm not interested. But other people who were affected were, and it was kind of extraordinary. I remember going to talk on the Pat Kenny show and sitting in the green room, and there was a woman who, a few days before my book came out, Michael D. Higgins hosted the laundry women in the Mansion House and had a dinner for them and an apology for them. And this woman in the green room told me that she had nobody in her family or nothing, but she just heard he was doing this, and she said to her family, I'm going to Dublin. And she drove up to Dublin, and
Your microphone is slightly covered there, Emer.
Oh,
that's it.
This woman drove up to Dublin, and she just wanted to stand outside the Mansion House as these women were coming in on buses. And loads of people spontaneously went and stood outside the Mansion House to honor those women. And it was a very moving, emotional time in Ireland. But those women have yet to be paid reparations, and they're getting old. They're in their 70s and 80s. We need to, reparations, no more than in the US, they need reparations for the descendants of slavery. It's a healing thing. If we live in a capitalist society and the church and the state benefited from the free labor of these women for so long, and children in industrial schools, all free labor, slavery, that we need to pay reparations, and we need to pay it now, because the time is running out. Time is running out, and that would be a huge acknowledgement. And I don't know why they're not doing it. They need to get on it and do it fast.
And surely and certainly your book and others, the new book too, will help push towards that.
Well, I don't know how much the people who hold the purse strings read literature or care, or because I just don't know why they haven't been moved to pay at this point. It still stuns me that we have, because there's, it's finite. These women's lives are finite. All our lives are finite, and we need to pay this generation for the healing to happen. And if we don't, we're left with this scar that is still unresolved.
It's been a fascinating conversation with you. The work that you're doing in the writing will continue, and maybe even closer when you get it all completed and finished. We'll talk again about it, the book and the launch, and how we can help to spread the word. For now, on this podcast, as it were, some of the questions I ask on the regular basis: regrets in leaving, or the benefits of where you are now, and would you return to Ireland? So that's about 3 questions in one, but answer as you will.
Okay. Just to say that Cruelty Men is out and has been released.
I know that. I know. I'm talking about the new book. Yes.
The new book. Yeah, the new book. I would, I think like every immigrant, there's always the pain there. There is a pain. There's a physical pain of missing the land. And when I come back, it's the relief of being in my own place. I guess the relief of being Indigenous. I remember when I did my DNA, and everybody was coming up with very exciting DNA, and my neighbor was saying, I'm part Choctaw and part Ashkenazi and part this and part that. And she was delighted with herself. And then I did mine, and it came out the only exotic thing was 7% Scottish, which doesn't seem very hard, and 2% Neanderthal. I took that. I went, okay, that's very cool, because they told me that's a very high reading of Neanderthal. So I was delighted with Neanderthal and Scottish, but the rest was like 90% Irish for thousands of years. So
I've just found a direct link between being the Neanderthal and being into anarchy.
The isms, Neanderthal.
We're back into the isms there, aren't we?
Yeah, Neanderthalism. Maybe that'll be, I could follow that. I could be a Neanderthalist.
What identification is a disaster for everything, even though this program is called Irish Diaspora, but you identify it well. So that's most of those questions asked about, except would you move back?
I would move back, probably if I could. I was happy living there again, but remember the crash happened and a lot of my jobs and gigs dried up, and a lot of my friends had to leave to Australia. And, we forget about that moment that I really couldn't make a living in Ireland at that time. So I headed off. And right now, there is the magical paycheck that comes in once a month. And I'm not sure I would get that in Ireland or be able to survive if I went back now. I would be there cobbling together, as I was before, just bits and pieces of teaching jobs and trying to survive and trying to do my writing. So financially keeps me away from Ireland, but I would kind of come back in a heartbeat. I really would. And I might go live in Kerry.
And sure, why not? Where else would you if you had the choice?
Where else would I live? I love Kerry. I love it down there.
I like Cork and Kerry and Galway and Mayo and Donegal, but I can only afford the house that I'm not living and paying for at the moment. So I don't think. I'm in Lurgan in County Armagh. Good chance to get the plug in. #LoveLurgan.
There you go.
It's a fabulous place. You'd love it. We've got a great historical connection with George Russell AE.
Would I be allowed to live up there as without a British passport at this point with Brexit?
Heaven forbid! Oh my goodness! Oh, you.
Will I need a visa?
Listen, I hope certainly not. Mind you, in recent days, it's up for discussion again. But no. This is not a political podcast, so we best not say too much more. But
I was up in Tyrone last summer. I was back in Ireland before the COVID summer, and we all went up to Tyrone because that's where my mother's family are all Tyrone, and we stayed in the Moy, and it's a gorgeous town.
Of course it is. It's a beautiful town.
Yeah,
and it has a connection back to Coot Hill. They both were built about the same time. Certainly, they not quite. They're later than the plantation, but about the 1800s, I'm thinking, and. Back to Coot Hill, just when you're talking about it, you mentioned it earlier, going up the street. It's one of the few towns in Ireland that has a multi-collection of churches of so many denominations. How easy would it be to find a Moravian church in an Irish town? And yet there's one on the top of the hill. I'm sure you know it. There's another denomination around the corner. It was a big linen place, just like Lurgan. And all the linen workers were coming from different parts of Europe, and they brought with them their different religions. It's amazing. It's a beautiful place. Lurgan, much the same origins. I'm holding up my passport to you in the video that we're recording, but nobody else can see it. So just don't say anything, okay? Just...
It's an Iranian passport.
Absolutely. Credentials approved. Thank you. It's safe to talk now. To finish up, I know, Emer, that you didn't choose a third piece, but you might have one off the top of your head. If there's any artist that we could play for you that would help either to define our conversation or your thoughts, just as you're thinking there, off the top of your head, a piece of music, whether it's Irish or otherwise, that would not necessarily define you, but you'd like to hear us play.
Well, I'll tell you something that had real resonance for us as Irish people always living in London and New York and abroad were the Pogues and Thousands Are Sailing. I still think that's such a poetic song that sums up, like I remember knowing it, like, you know, postcards were mailing of, seas and oceans from rooms the daylight never sees. No lights glow here on Christmas trees. And just it captures the pathos of, that revelry. And we'd go out as Irish people and have mad nights out and almost sort of Dionysian, Bacchanalian Irish crowd of diaspora. We're always the loudest and the rowdiest, But, underneath there was a sort of deep, brooding melancholy as well of, going back and coping with, immigration and poverty and not being as successful as you wanted to be and disappointment and the feeling of not really belonging and of being other. And I think that song always resonated with me as a young Irish immigrant.
It's a perfect choice, absolutely, and well described and critiqued as well. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much, Emer, for giving us the time. And hopefully we'll talk again soon. And the best of luck to you, your family in California.
Okay, and love Lurgan, Donagh, love Lurgan.
The island, it is silent now, but the ghosts still haunt the waves. And a torch lights up a famished man who fortune could not save.
And a big thank you to Emer Martin, who joined us this evening. This is Irish Voices, Conversations with the Irish Diaspora. If you'd like to get in touch, it's easy to do so. You can go to our website. You can get to myself, Donagh McKeown, at gmail.com, or you can go to our Irish Voices webpage. Just go to irishvoices.net and you'll find our page and our podcast page on there too. If you'd like to help us in our efforts, well, I've just opened a Patreon site. It's www.patreon.com/Irish Voices. And equally, if you'd like to just buy us a coffee, well, that's good too. Much appreciated. www.buymeacoffee.com/Irish Voices PODC. There should be a link to all of those in our comments below. And that is another Irish Voices Conversations with the Irish Diaspora. Look out for the next one and make sure you subscribe perhaps to our new YouTube channel by the same name. We look forward to either seeing you or hearing from you in the very near future. This has been an Irish Voices production.